Good morning and welcome to Soul of Travel, Voices of Women. This season, we're focusing on all of the amazing women in this space of travel and creating a space for conversation. Today, I'm really excited to be talking to Dr. Emily Thomas of Durham University, and she's also the author of The Meaning of Travel, Philosophers Abroad. And I go into this conversation knowing full well I already want to spend like 6 hours talking with you. And so I'm going to edit and also already hope that strategically I can bring you back to talk about the things that I know we're not going to talk about today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And in researching and preparing for this conversation, I came across the I guess, goal of yours to move philosophy kind of out of academia into more mainstream conversations. And so I'm really excited about that this is a space for that to happen. And also, I like the idea of kind of breaking down the idea of philosophy being this unattainable space and the fact that kind of we're all philosophers at heart, right? That we're all seeking the answers of the universe. And so as I was preparing, I just love that idea so much. And I've kind of seen the periphery of that in getting to know you. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of time to introduce yourself, and then we'll just move on from there.
Fantastic, thank you. Yes, I definitely think philosophy should not just be confined to universities and schools. And it really is about asking the big questions: what life is all about, what is goodness, what is time, and how we should relate to one another in society. And this is stuff that I think we do talk about and think about often. So yeah, definitely, I think philosophy is actually a really core pursuit for humanity. Yeah. That's a really big statement, but I'm going to stick with it. So I do philosophy in a university. I mostly work on history of philosophy, and I like working on the biggest questions that there are. So particularly stuff like, what is the nature of reality? What are space and time?
That's so amazing to me, and I come from it from both sides. Like, that seems impossible, and yet why would you spend your time thinking about anything else?
Yes, I agree.
And I immediately am like, oh, I want to read everything about it. Like, this just was a catalyst to that researcher part of my mind. I have a background in sociology, and I actually spent a lot of time helping one of our associate professors with her lit review. And like that I guess like systematic side of me loved like how, going through and highlighting the words and counting and organizing and structuring. And so when I first heard of you, which actually I would love to just shout out, I had heard you talk with my friend Mike Scheibel on his podcast, and I just was so excited to like combine like this really kind of like regimented academic perspective of something that for me has always been like real freeing and loose, and like it seems contradictory, and yet like when you examine it closer, it so goes hand in hand. So I loved that about connecting with you and your story and your book.
Oh, I'm really glad to hear that. I think that's brilliant. It is definitely the case that we work on these really big grand ideas, but then on a day-to-day basis, though, you're absolutely right, it's about highlighting and reading really dull, geeky material that you then have to structure into literature reviews.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the process. Like it seems, and again, like it seems unobtainable, but when you look at the starting point as something like that, like really, if you have the patience, anybody could like start out on that road and explore something that's interesting to them and see what else people have already talked about, thought about, and then that triggers your own perception. And then we have to give value to our thoughts, which is also really hard to do, right?
Yes, definitely. Constructing arguments and formulating viewpoints, it's difficult stuff.
So I'm going to start, I guess, at the beginning, which is a great place to start, right? I know that you grew up in a small town that was very picturesque, and I can really relate to that. I grew up in rural Montana in a very small town that, you know, many travelers go to because of its beauty. And I definitely did not appreciate it at the time. I spent much of my childhood wishing to get out of there, and also to understand just the rest of the world. Like I remember being really little and asking my mom why we didn't have culture where I lived. And I'm sure she thought that I was crazy. Like, what are you even talking about? And interestingly enough, I grew up on an Indian reservation, and I mean, there was a lot of culture that I just maybe didn't fully understand at the time. But I also, I'm like, I want to see things that are thousands of years old, and I want to understand how that ties into like the beginning of humanity. Like, I just constantly was seeking and reaching. And I eventually worked for this tour company, and the very first tour they asked me to lead, and they go everywhere in the world, they said, "We'd love to have you guide on the Montana rail trip." And my heart broke. I thought, I get to literally go where I went to university, where I grew up. We took like a bus right past my grandparents' house. And I thought, oh, I can't even believe the injustice of this. And then I had this experience of seeing my home through all of these other people's eyes. And it shifted my perspective in how we observe what is around us. And for you, I'm wondering a little bit, I know that you had mentioned that when you set out to explore, you kind of didn't want to explore your European backyard. You wanted to get out and see the rest of the world. So if you might just share with us a little bit about where you grew up and what got you out exploring the rest of the world.
I can. So I grew up in the Channel Islands, which are absolutely tiny. I grew up mostly on the island of Guernsey, which is 9 miles by 7. It's really piddly. You can drive from any point to any point in like 20 minutes maximum. Very small. It's very beautiful. But I definitely wanted to get beyond there and get beyond Europe, actually. I used to think that countries like the US or Canada were really similar to the UK. I think I would have said that somewhere like Germany or the Netherlands is more different to the UK than somewhere like the US. And then as soon as I left Europe for the first time, I realized, oh no, I'm so European. I'm so baked into this, into the way of living that you take history for granted. You know, there's 400-year-old buildings regularly on the streets that you walk past. There's a kind of way of conducting government and life that all just seems really familiar to me, in a way that when you go to a country like the US or Canada, and it's largely English speaking, so there's this illusion of similarity, but then you realize, oh no, it's actually really different, like much more so. And I realized quite quickly I'm much more interested in seeing places that are different to Europe than seeing other parts of Europe. And that somehow that experience is more valuable to me, I think. So I was living in the Netherlands when I wrote the book on philosophy of travel. And it was surprising to me how quickly the Netherlands felt extremely familiar. like it felt like home within a couple of months. And despite the language difference from there in the UK, yeah, I feel like, yeah, terribly European. I can't shake it.
Yeah, I don't think that is a bad thing at all. And I think it is interesting how we have perceptions. And I think that's the most valuable tool of travel, is breaking those down and letting you see the reality of things. Like we all receive our information in the package it comes in, from media and television and books and stories from our family and through our education. And it's never quite right. It just can't be, because it's just one version of existence. And
Yeah,
when
yeah,
you set out to see the world, you really get to take it in through your eyes, which carries some of those connotations, but then they start to fall off as you realize that, yes, English and English have nothing to do with one another. And
yeah,
that, yes, that, you know, you're really at home in these places you wouldn't expect to be at home. And
yeah.
I felt that one of my first backpacking trips was to Thailand, and I expected to feel really disjointed. And honestly, I just felt really embraced, and like something I had been seeking for a really long time was given to me. And yeah, really felt at home. And then that kind of kept happening. And then I realized, like, it's that aspect of travel that feels comfortable to me, like curiosity and exploring. And I don't know if you've had similar experiences where you really expect to feel maybe challenged, and then it is always challenging, but then always like there's this other side to it.
Yes, I think I have reached a point with travel where my expectations of not being challenged are so low that then the feeling of being challenged actually starts to feel really familiar. That, you
Yeah.
know, when you work out strategies for navigating places where you don't speak the language and you can't even read the street signs, and gradually that becomes normal. Like that process becomes familiar in a nice way, I think. And I really enjoy visiting somewhere and finding out how little I know about a place. I find that really reassuring. And being in that state of total ignorance where everything you're really learning for the first time. And yeah, I really enjoy that as a traveler.
I think that that is actually an interesting parallel that I would see between philosophy and travel, right? Because as a philosopher, you're setting out to answer impossible questions, right? You're always starting from that space of unknown and hoping to get to known. And travel is kind of the same way, right?
Yeah,
You don't know anything, and you hope you survive and that you know in the end.
yeah,
So
yeah. I
it's like,
fully agree.
yeah, the experiences of both are really similar. And that's something I love so much in thinking about this, was like starting with how could philosophy and travel be so intertwined. And I I'm just curious for you, what helped you to bring those two things together? I mean, you love both, but what made the connection to write the book about the two together?
There was no clear impetus. It felt like writing the book was something completely unintentional. I was working on other things. I finished this big project, and then I kind of had a bit of a lull in my research into incredibly geeky topics about space and time. And suddenly, I was like, I wonder what philosophy said about travel. And before I quite knew what I was doing, I began doing lots of research into it and finding what philosophers have said about travel, looking for connections between philosophy and travel. And I wasn't certain I would find anything, but actually I found lots. And then one of the things that you've mentioned there, this unknown that they have in common, they're both fascinated by it. And I think it goes even deeper than wanting to move from the unknown to the known. I think a lot of what philosophy and travel are doing is trying to map out new places and new areas of thought that we didn't even know exist before. So when the explorer climbs that last mountain or looks behind that last moon, they don't even know what unknown regions they're going to find there. And it's almost about saying, here's this whole new place that's completely unknown. Someone needs to head into it. And I think philosophers do the same. So when you look at questions like, what is goodness, what is time, these questions haven't been around forever. Someone had to ask them for the first time, and when they asked those questions, they were mapping out a whole new area of unknown thought. And I think because they share this fascination with the unknown, that has led a lot of philosophers to compare their philosophical inquiries to journeys. So you have some really lovely passages, for example, in David Hume's Treatise of Human Nature, where it's a really skeptical work. He's questioning everything that people think they know about the world. And about halfway through the book, he compares himself to a man who's been shipwrecked on rocks, and he's looking out to sea, wondering whether it's safe for him to put forth into the unknown again. So I think, I actually think philosophy and travel are really deeply connected by this theme.
Yeah, I agree. I really felt that curiosity was a common thread, and seeking and searching, and also like there's this kind of romantic notion around both things, right? Like there's the romantic notion of philosophy, which you've kind of debunked with all of our highlighting.
Yeah, true.
And the romantic notion of travel. And I just think that that's kind of what lures people into both spaces and kind of what we seek. And so I think that is really interesting. I want to talk a little bit about so many things. Here's where I'm going to my huge list of notes here. But well, one, in looking at the reviews for The Meaning of Travel, I loved this thought that said, this is the finest kind of travel, not just across continents, but through time, space, and our infinite minds. The journey is the joy. For me, that resonated really strongly because I kind of see travel as something that doesn't only happen when we go somewhere. And so like we can journey in our mind, we can journey in our heart, we can journey within ourselves. And so similar to what you were saying, it's that idea of journey that ties those two things together. And so, and also a lot of people, I think we were talking a little before we hopped on here, but we, when we're really kind of in this creative space and this curious space, we end up wearing all these hats that go with each curiosity. And then all of a sudden we're sitting here with this pile of things that we're interested in. And kind of, I'm guessing like you were like, travel, philosophy, feminism, where do women stand in all of this? And you were like, can I make this into something? And then this like beautiful thing happens. And I just love that about people who are open to that. Like we don't need to have, we're not seeking a label to fit into a category we need to fit into. And so then it gives us freedom to create something unique. So I really love that you have all of these things that you're really interested in, and they've become a part of this project. And for you, as it unfolded, so you're researching, you're finding these connections, you're starting to realize this is a thing. Where did it go from there? Like, how did you move forward?
Actually, the moving forward was the hard part. I ended up in this situation where I had lots and lots of material. So I found all these connections. I found all these philosophers who had what I thought were like big important things to say about travel, but it was all a kind of mess because no one had really worked on philosophical issues in travel in a systematic way before. There was no obvious guide to how I should like move through them, or so I ended up, I guess, creating a narrative. And so I think that philosophers got really interested in travel in the 16th century age of discovery, which makes sense given that I'm working on Western philosophy, and that's when Europeans suddenly began sailing all their ships all over the world, and they're bringing home these travel tales, and philosophers get caught up in the excitement of travel, just like the rest of Europe is really. You know, they're human beings, they're part of European society. And then I think they begin asking these questions. What can travel tell us about the world? What can philosophy say about travel? What kind of pursuit is this? And so slowly I began constructing a narrative running from the 16th century towards the present day, looking at the way that philosophy and travel have kind of met on various issues, and then they wander apart for a little while and then they come back together again. In terms of the way I ended up folding my interests in, yeah, that just happened. So I work in philosophy, and there's no reason why you should know this, but although there have been women philosophers throughout history, they've largely been ignored. So on most undergraduate philosophy courses, you wouldn't learn about women philosophers prior to the mid-20th century, say. And I certainly had the impression when I was a student that that's just how it was, that women entered philosophy maybe in like the 1930s, and that's when it got going. But of course, that's not the case at all. Women philosophers had been around since the pre-Socratics in the age of Plato and Aristotle. And that's something that as an academic I've been really sensitive to. And of course, there are these huge parallels in travel. So although women began traveling in great numbers in the 20th century, there have been, you know, centuries of women travelers before that, just not nearly as many of them. So really famous ones are people like Mary Kingsley and Isabella Bird. And once I began, I guess because I was looking for the women anyway, then you begin thinking, well, are the same mechanisms functioning in travel as in philosophy when it comes to excluding women or not including them in our histories? And the answers, of course, are yes.
Right. Yeah, that was another thing that came up for me as I was learning more about you. And I thought, oh my gosh, like she has that same nudge that I kept getting. I remember being in middle school probably, and we had a report we needed to write on World War One, and like my first thought was, oh yes, I'm going to write about women in World War One. And I go to the library ready to find all of these books and this wealth of knowledge on all the great things women did in this time. And, you know, there's the history section and the World War One section. And there's this book that has like 4 pages on women in World War One. And I thought, this can't be right. And then World War II came around the next year, and I march into the library, and I'm sure the librarian was just like hiding from me because she knew it was coming. And then we had to write on media, and then we were discussing Shakespeare, and everything for me was like, where are women in this picture? And so for me, your look at where women are in both philosophy and travel was both like exciting, and I also knew it was going to be frustrating for me because of the kind of absence of women. And not that they weren't there, it's just in how their stories were being told. And you know, that's really how this Voices of Women season started for me, is that, you know, I would sit at a travel conference and think, oh, I'm so inspired by this one woman and this one woman. And then I was pulling back and looking, and I'm like, well, wait, that's the only 2 women who were there. And so, yes, I am inspired by them, but where are the rest of the women? And, sometimes they were in the audience with me, and especially in the space of adventure travel, I would often be surrounded by men. And not that they weren't all honorable and great and doing great work and really celebrating our successes. I just wanted to create a space where we really could share our stories and inspire other people. And so I really loved how you began to look at that. And then as I was reading your article that you shared with me on Lady Travelers, and just the title of it made me so very happy. I can't even express to you. I literally have a bag sitting next to me that says Where Feminism Meets Travel from Unearthed Women magazine. And I started reading this and I was like, don't start to feel that rage. Don't start to feel that, like, it's going to happen. You're going to start to get angry. And I'm like, no, let's just read it. And then the like tagline that you have in here of the beardiness of travel, suffrage, and philosophy. Like, again, I'm like, oh, she is my sister at heart for sure. And I can't wait. And I don't want to hear what she has to say. So in this article, which hasn't been published yet, I would love to dive into this.
It is coming out. It is definitely coming out.
Yes.
Just not yet.
And I hope that it's coming out, that I can share when we actually release this, because we are pre-recording this interview. But I really love how it kind of looks at how society treats both women in travel and in philosophy, and then this idea that the fact that traveler tales were typically celebrating male explorers. So not that the women weren't there, but they weren't being celebrated. And then also really the conceptualization of travel as masculine. And so even if a woman wanted to step into that space, she had to step into that space as masculine, which obviously parallels so many things in our current world, which is also why I really loved this. And then that women who were in travel were also then portrayed as masculine. And then that contrast, when you found these women were actually feminine, and how uncomfortable that made people. And so I would love to just kind of talk through this portion of your research and what you've been finding, and also when it would say that travelers were when they were women travelers, they were exceptional. And my mind is like, exceptional, yay, they're amazing. And it really means they were exceptional in that they were the exception, and they were the only ones who could really understand. They were lucky enough to have the mind that could, think philosophically or step into this travel. So I know I just laid out about a million things for us to talk about, but if you could just kind of unwrap some of that for us.
I can. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so in philosophy, something that feminist philosophers are quite interested in is the way that ideas can become associated with a gender. So today, for example, we often think of pinkness as associated with girls, and maybe blueness associated with baby boys. And these associations happen sort of historically, and then they become ingrained in society in various ways. And lots of researchers have argued compellingly, I think, that travel is associated with men. If you look at the history of travel, if you just Google lists of famous travelers or lists of historical explorers, they're almost all men. You'll get people like Scott of the Antarctic and Captain Cook sailing around the world. It's such a history of men. And philosophy is exactly the same. If you ask anyone on the street to name a philosopher, they will almost certainly name a man. Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Kant, these are exactly the names that you're going to get. And so both philosophy and travel, in virtue of their history, are associated with men. And what that means is that women who undertake those practices are also seen to be really masculine. So what people have found looking at the history of women travellers is that they are literally described as being manly or masculine. So I think like Mary Kingsley is described as having like manly courage and a man's strength. Mary Wollstonecraft, he was a 18th century philosopher and also a travel writer. In reviews of her travel book, A Short Residence in Sweden, Norway and Denmark, the reviews literally say things like, this lady traveller has a masculine mind. They really praise her, her manly courage for wandering around these places. And what this does is create the impression that regular women can't do these things. In order to do travel or do philosophy, you have to be exceptional. And really, by exceptional, they mean like a man. So it's only very manly women who will succeed, because if you're a feminine woman, of course, you just won't be able to. And so that led to these perceptions of these women as being really masculine. And then what you get is people who've read their travel books or their philosophy, when they meet them for the first time, they're suddenly astonished that they're meeting these, perhaps sort of very sort of pretty, feminine, petite women, and you have astonishing statements. There was a writer who met Mary Kingsley for the first time, and he talked about how he expected to meet someone sort of broad-shouldered and sturdy, and instead she's this tiny bird-like woman with a very sweet face. And so this contrast between the way they were portrayed and then the way they were perceived, it leads to various issues. And what these women often ended up doing was trying to stress how feminine they really were. So when it comes to, especially with lady women explorers, they pay a lot of attention to what they're wearing in their travel books. And they want to stress that, yes, I'm traveling and exploring around the world, but I'm not doing it in trousers. I'm doing it in like my full Victorian bustle. Of course. There's a really great passage in one of Kingsley's books about Africa, where she describes how she's wandering intrepid through the jungle, that she falls into a jaguar pit, but happily she's saved from the spikes because she was wearing a really good thick woolen skirt. And of course, what she's saying there, she's trying to be funny, but it's no accident that she's also stressing the fact she's very much wearing feminine, women-only garb. Right. And so you end up with this really strong association between travel, philosophy, and these being manly things, and then women who are entering upon them are also perceived as being manly. And that's the only reason that they get away with it.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And again, like I said, like on the edge of infuriating, but I'm trying not to access that in myself. And
it's okay to be infuriated. I think it's an appropriate reaction.
I also just thought it was so interesting how then kind of building upon that is where these women then came back and they really rejected these feminist movements, and particularly the suffrage movement. And I wonder, like, in part, was it only to save face and to create this image, or did they really feel this way? But I don't know, it just was so interesting. And in your article you talk about, them rejecting this suffrage movement, but also this story of, and I'm going to pronounce her name wrong, Wollstonecraft, is that how you say it?
Yeah, Wollstonecraft. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
I
all
did it
good.
right. I was like, wow, all of a
Don't
sudden,
worry.
I'm sure this is going to happen right now. That she was really this leader and a cautionary tale. Like, she couldn't just be a leader. She couldn't be this one paving the way. And that her writing really opened the doors for female travel writers, but created this warning at the same time that you can only be masculine in one area of your life. Like, you can't really, you can't say that you're a traveler and celebrate that you're feminine. Like, you just can't. So she kind of created this, like, opening and this barrier at the same time, which I thought was really interesting. And then I also loved that you mentioned in A Short Residence that she couldn't avoid being the first person in her story. Like, that the narrative was about her, and traditionally this wasn't how travel was shared, and that she was really credited with shifting travel writing into this more personal account over scientific documentation. So she's a really, really important historical figure who is shunned really for being herself. So I would love for you to just talk a little bit about that as well.
I can definitely do that. So Mary Wollstonecraft grew up in England, and she initially became known as a feminist philosopher. So she published in the 1780s this book called A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and it's a long book essentially arguing that men and women should have the same rights. And of course, back in the 18th century, they really don't have the same rights. I mean, women can't earn all kinds of livings. Generally, women are educated to a much younger age than men are. You know, women can't own property unless they're widowed. Like, there's a whole, as in society was very different back then. And she's arguing that, you know, women should be able to own property and have whatever jobs they like, that they should even be able to participate in government, which was really radical at the time. So she becomes known as this feminist philosopher, which already is really unusual for a woman to be publishing philosophy. But it's kind of tolerated, actually. The reviews of her book are fairly positive. People take it okay. A few years later, she goes abroad to Scandinavia, travels around Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And while she's there, she writes a travel book about it. Again, this was really, really unusual for a woman to do. So there had been a few travel books published by women before the 18th century, but not many. So one study estimates that there were maybe 20 published in Europe before 1800, which is just teeny tiny. And so it was a really unusual thing that she was doing. But again, it was received fairly positively. She was called masculine repeatedly in the book reviews, but they kind of liked the two books. And then what happens after she dies is that her husband published some memoirs about her that reveal details of her life that were really shocking to sort of 18th century Europe. So it revealed the fact that she hadn't actually been married to her first husband, that there had been some suicide attempts, and then suddenly she's just vilified by the press. There are magazine articles written about her, that she becomes, her character is used in novels and poetry. She's held up as this cautionary tale really explicitly. This is what happens when a woman becomes too masculine. And I mean, people literally say that. Mm-hmm. They accuse her of being unsexed, of not being a woman, of lacking feminine instincts. And you get the really strong impression that people think she just did one male thing too many. Maybe if she'd stuck to just doing philosophy or just doing travel, she would have gotten away with it. But the fact that she did both, people just couldn't hold back. And they argue, because of these masculine characteristics, this is what led to her ruin. This is why we're all entitled to really hate Mary Wollstonecraft. And what's astonishing is that this continues right up until the 20th century. I actually recently read a book review published in 1970 where they describe her as being like silly and meddlesome. And I mean, it's really vitriolic, the sort of hatred that's poured on top of her. And so when it comes to women travellers after Wollstonecraft, what you find is almost none of them are interested in feminist issues. And in fact, a strong subset of them, including people like Kingsley and Bird and Gertrude Bell, are actively anti-suffragist. So in the late 19th century, you have all these movements going on where people are saying, maybe women really should have the vote now. Maybe that would be a useful thing. And you have these female explorers who you would imagine to be kind of strong, powerful, progressive figures who are actively using their platform to reject women having the vote. There's this wonderful line from one of them who says, I absolutely don't think women should have the vote. I wouldn't use it if I had one. I should be terribly bored of the whole thing. Think, gosh. So the question is, why is it that these otherwise powerful women are so anti-feminist? And one explanation is that the suffragettes were seen as being really masculine for wanting to engage in politics. So in exactly the same way that women travellers and women philosophers are described as masculine, so are the suffragettes. And just like the women travellers, the suffragettes tried to counter that by wearing really delicate feminine clothing. They're trying to stress, no, we really are women, despite the fact that we're trying to engage in politics. And so you might think these Victorian women explorers were worried that it's one thing to travel, but it would be another thing to do politics as well, and that we just shouldn't do more than one male thing. And I think that the cautionary tale of Wollstonecraft is very much playing in the background here, because the vilification of Wollstonecraft just went on for decades. I mean, right through the 18th and 19th centuries. And I think these women travellers were really conscious of just not doing what she did. It's fine that they're travelling, but they don't want to do feminist philosophy or politics as well. They just want to leave it be.
Yeah, so interesting. And I think too of just some interviews I've even heard recently with women who are, for me, I idolize them as explorers. And one woman, Kelly Edwards, I remember her telling a story of showing up to, she's a pilot, and showing up to pick up her airplane, in some rural, middle of nowhere, maybe in Africa, let's say. And the people there saying like, well, we'll just wait until your pilot gets here. Yes, that's fine. And of course, her name also happens to be Kelly, right? So the confusion could overlap. And, I am the pilot. And if you see her, she's very feminine. And it's the same, almost the same response, right? Like that just can't possibly be you because you're a woman and you're feminine and you couldn't possibly be flying this plane from, here to there by yourself. And you would think that we would have dropped that narrative by now. And
Yeah.
It's just so interesting how it's almost as strong as ever. And I was even thinking about when I travel that one of the things I really do to ensure I'm safe is to be less feminine, right? I wear long slacks, I cover my skin, I might pull my hair back and wear a hat. And contrary to they were making sure they were very feminine so they weren't deemed masculine, you know, we kind of are still fitting into that mold to be an explorer and to be showing up in the world this way. And so I think that's part of why I was so rattled by this article, is because I would like to think that this history is in the past, and
Yeah.
yet it's lingering here, and is, again, is kind of the premise of this platform and this conversation and this space, to maybe kind of honor. I feel like my next book tote needs to be like, you know, Wollstonecraft is like my hero or something. Like, I want to honor and celebrate this path that she forged, and to kind of break down this cautionary tale. Like, we can be women, and we can be travelers, and we can be like leading the way. And so yeah, I just,
I mean, the happy ending of Wollstonecraft now, I guess, is that by the mid 20th century, her reputation was rehabilitated.
yes.
So people really began to see, oh no, she really was very important for feminism. Yeah, and now, as you said, there are various bits of research showing how she was really one of the pioneers of this new style of travel writing, writing in the first person, making it personal. So that's good. I think people are coming to see what an important figure she was.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I just had this pit in my stomach for her for a moment, of like how much she did, and that she didn't get to see the benefit of what she created for so
That's
many
true.
people.
Yeah. Yes, I agree, actually. I think she'd be very pleased to know things like now women do have the vote. You know, there are women on the Supreme Court. Yeah, I think she'd be really heartwarmed by those things.
Yeah. Well, yes, while we're still trying, you know, we're still seeing those gaps, like the things that have come together since her time, she would definitely be very proud of. So
yeah, I think so too. It's not that everything's fixed, but we've made a lot of progress.
yeah. Well, I think, I mean, I would love to dive more into the book, but I think we've really talked about some things that for me were really important to bring into this conversation and to bring awareness to. And so while I mentioned that I would I know love to have you back to talk about everything else that we've missed, I think that I'm going to be happy to leave us in that space. The only other thing that I would love to play with is this end note, and I'm just trying to find it because I didn't even have my regular notes up for me, because I knew that we were going to be operating out of a different space for this conversation. But is one is just for people who I know are going to be interested in more about your work. Where can they find? I know your book is available both in book form and in Audible, but if they want to learn more about that, and if you want to share where your article is going to be published, I would love to give you the space to do that.
Happily. The book, The Meaning of Travel, is definitely the thing to read if you want to know more about the relationship between philosophy and travel. Yeah, so there's a chapter in there about how travel is a gendered thing and the various problems that that's caused. But this specific article on Mary Wollstonecraft is coming out in History Today. I don't yet have a publication date, but I hope it won't be too far in the future.
Yes, great. And I will definitely share that, even if it's after this episode is shared. So just to end, the rapid fire questions are just for my listeners to get a little bit of a better sense of you, which we didn't really get to. I mean, we got to really understand your work in this way, but you as a traveler we didn't get there as much, which again, that's where I would love to bring you back for another conversation. But what is your favorite book or movie that offers you a travel escape or inspires you to travel?
You know, actually, one of the very early books I read that I found really inspirational was Paul Theroux's The Great Railway Bazaar. I absolutely loved that. Yeah, this idea of this guy just sort of sitting on a train, like moodily watching the world go by and trying to understand the passengers and the landscapes that he was passing through. Yeah, I really liked that.
What is always in your suitcase or your backpack when you travel?
I'm one of the plastic bag backpackers who thinks that it's really useful if everything in a suitcase is packed in individual plastic bags. I'm not sure how useful it really is when it comes to packing. I'm really one of those people. Yeah, other than that, it's just the regular boring stuff, clothes and shampoo.
Yeah, perhaps one monsoon too many. I've had that experience of
A lot of books, actually. So back in the days before Kindles, I would always have maybe 3 or 4 books to swap at backpacker shelves. I'm a fast reader, so I have to have a lot of books to keep me going on train journeys.
I relate. What has been your favorite destination?
Antarctica, for sure, actually.
Yeah.
It's really, for me, it was like being on the surface of another planet. And I'd read Sarah Wheeler's Terra Incognita before I visited. So I think I visited with this whole awareness of the history and especially the science dimension to the continent. The idea of preserving an entire landmass for science, I think, really caught my imagination, in addition to just how strange it is as a place.
Yeah.
It's definitely been, the most spectacular place I've been, I think.
Where do you still long to visit?
So many places. The lockdown is really sad, frankly. I've been to, I think, 7 or 8 countries in Africa, but there's like 60 more. I'd like to see a lot more of that continent. I'd also like to see more of the Middle East, frankly. It can be really beautiful, as well as the fascinating history, and I'd like to see a lot more of that. And I hope that the virus will allow us to do that in the not too distant future.
I agree. And I also agree on both those destinations. Like, I've just had some of my most magical experiences both in the Middle East and in Africa. So yes, I concur. What do you eat that immediately connects you to a place you've been?
That's a good question. Actually, that's a really good question. Do you know, I feel like a lot of the things I've eaten when I've been traveling would be impossible to recreate. Like, I'm not really sure what's been in them. It's been strange bowls of stew with things bobbing, and you just hope for the best. I think Asian cuisine is always very distinctive. And what I really miss is Indian vegetarian food. I found it in the UK, it's really hard to get good Indian vegetarian food. There's one vegetarian dish on the menu and it's just not the same. You really got to go to like parts of London which have the specialist restaurants.
Yeah. Who, and this is a good question for you, who was the person that inspired or encouraged you to set out and explore the world?
That is good. Actually, books, I think. Just a little bit of a sad answer, perhaps. Reading lots of books about travel really gave me a thirst for it. And then as soon as you do some, you realize, this is really doable. I can do more. And then the addiction begins.
Yeah, I love making travel achievable for as many people as possible. So yes, I think I agree. It takes one step and then you realize that you really can do it.
Yeah.
If you could take an adventure, again, a great one for you, with one person, fictional or real, alive or past, who would it be?
That is really nice, actually. I think I would pick someone who would be entertaining. Someone like Montaigne, actually. So he's a philosopher, he's profound, but he's also very funny. His essays are brilliant, and they're insightful and thoughtful. I think he'd be a good traveling companion.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I have just enjoyed so much the experience of getting to know you through preparing to speak to you, having this conversation, and sharing your work. I feel like so many people will be inspired to read your book and to kind of just think about things in a different way, and to know that philosophy and travel really are available to everyone. And so I appreciate you creating the space for that awareness to happen, and for being here to share this with all of my listeners.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here.